Well, that's kind of a lead into what I was thinking about too, David, which is anybody who's followed us at Unbound and other places knows that, and I won't speak for both of us, but knows that I have and we don't talk about this a lot, but certainly more of a conservative political leaning in the sense that I would prefer to have a smaller government than a larger government. You might hear that echoed in this thing I just talked about here. And that for the most part, I would prefer private entities and private citizens and private businesses to figure out most things with as little government interference as possible. So I'm acknowledging that because this is one place where I continually find myself really advocating for government intervention. And I think it's worth sort of sitting back and looking at this. As much as government regulations can be problematic and we should look at them and think of them carefully, the reality is that we continually rely on a modern world that is governed by laws that make it possible for us to move through it well. And that includes laws that have regulations on how businesses interact, that have antitrust laws, so there's actually competition, that have intellectual property laws so people can benefit from their own creativity, that have plagiarism laws so people don't steal other people's ideas. And they are imperfectly, certainly, administered and can sometimes trend to the regulatory in problematic ways. And yet, without them, I'm just too much of a realist to think that a complete laissez-faire economic system is actually workable. I've been doing a lot of renovation to a house, and I'm building a new building and working with electricity a lot. And electricity does some awesome things, including making this thing possible. And yet it can kill you in a heartbeat, literally. And the reason that it doesn't is because there's an awful lot of regulations and inspections. I just put a high voltage line into my house and then another one out to this building. And there were some regulations and some rules and some codes that we had to go through, which, yes, makes things a little slower and yes, makes things a little more expensive. On the other hand, it also makes it so that I don't electrocute myself and that I don't burn the house down or burn the building down. And I think if you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking about AI critically, in my mind, there ought to be a much bigger movement in this country talking to as wise of politicians as we can find and legislators and think tanks and saying, we should be having some serious thoughts about some legislative barriers here that make sense. David, there's a little known line in one of the bills that passed, and I can't remember if it was like the infrastructure bill or the anti-inflation, whatever. One of these, this is where I get annoyed with government, right? That basically says all new cars have to have a kill switch in them. So if you're going to buy a car made after like 2030 or 2025 or something like that, there has to be a way for that car to be disabled. And the idea is for the police, in a high-speed chase to be able to flip a switch and boom, your car's dead. Now, the individual freedom part of me really despises that, thinks it's problematic. There's also a little known line in there that says that there has to be a device that can check to see whether you're drunk before you're allowed to start the car. There has to be all new cars coming up. You can Google that and check that out. That's a pretty wild thing as well. And so good intentions, makes you really wonder how that's going to work. Do you have to like blow into a thing every time you get into your car to start it? That's the kind of thing people are asking.
Yeah.
However, when it comes to this, I'd really like it if the government would say, you develop an AI, that sucker has to be unpluggable. There has to be some place where we know maybe the government, maybe you can. I don't know how they work this out. But in order for you to build a functioning AI to get a license to use these things, or I don't know if a license is the right way, or for you to take one to market, there has to be a way for you to turn it off. That would be an interesting. I don't know how possible that even is technologically, but some things like that would make me feel a little better about trending into the future with a couple of checks and balances. And I realize that'd be an imperfect process and a bit messy. So anyhow, an unplug feature seems like it'd make me sleep better at night, especially after watching the freaky robots that showed up at the UN meeting. What about you, David? If you were trying to guesstimate or come up with some legislative walls, what would you look for?
Yeah, so I think I will push back on a couple of things here.
Great.
The first of which is that while I generally agree with your point that I think that regulation could be helpful, it's the problem with advocating for regulation with our frankly current crop of politicians is that they are so extraordinarily technologically illiterate. And it drives me absolutely insane.
I think what you just said is they're really old. Is that what you said, David?
Not necessarily, because there can be older individuals who are more technically literate than others. But I just flash back to the Senate hearing in which someone asked Mark Zuckerberg how Facebook makes money, and he had to reply, "Senator, we run ads." And just the fact that questions like that have to be asked, or just recently, I think this was last year or so, actually in Missouri, which is where I live, the governor essentially pursued charges on somebody who reported a problem where you could find teacher social security numbers on their website. And this person did something that literally you or I could do with literally one button push on our browser. And they pursued charges against him for hacking. And just the mind-boggling lack of understanding of how technology works and how it should be legislated just makes me just cringe just a little bit and have pause whenever we are talking about what legislation needs to be put in place for especially technologies that there is such quick advancement around and there is so little common understanding of how they work. So I feel like if there was going to be some sort of legislation that would be passed, I would really and truly hope that we would be able to have a good education of what exactly these laws are meaning, what their implications are, and ultimately that the politicians who would be writing and making these laws would have an actual understanding of what they're signing, which I feel like is a potentially vain hope in our modern political world, but it is my hope nonetheless.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, and I think it might sound like I was joking a little bit, but we do have a ridiculously old political class right now, older than typical, and that is a problem for a lot of reasons, but it's a liability, particularly when it comes to things like technology. Mm-hmm. There is something interesting, though, Dave. We have an alumni from our program who works on Capitol Hill. In fact, my family was just there last week, and we toured the Capitol. And this person was able to take us around and show us some behind-the-scenes stuff. And she's been there on Capitol Hill in various jobs for quite a while, and she just moved into a pretty prestigious position for a particular congressman. And she said something that I thought was interesting. She said, the reality is that the legislators very rarely understand what they're voting for or what's in the bill. It's the staffers who know that. And the average age of the staffer in Capitol Hill is about 28. Now, Congress is not in session. We visited last week. And so we went into the Cannon office building. And as we looked around the Cannon office building, I didn't see anybody over the age of 30, including security guards. And as we went through the tour in the Capitol, the other groups are being toured by their constituent bodies. Again, same thing. So, we've got the folks running the staff of these things are actually much younger. So that's kind of interesting. It's likely that the staff that is 28 is going to be advising the congressperson who's 110 how to vote and how to make decisions on this. So maybe that gives a little hope. But I think the other thing here is that, when those legislation things come, and this is the messy, ugly, and often corrupt part of it, but all the special interest groups will pile in. And they're the ones that will craft it and all those things. Now there's a problem to that. But there's also an opportunity there. And so maybe, this podcast is a pretty modest reach, but maybe this would be a clarion call to some special interest groups out there. There's a need for people to form special interest groups around this. There's a need for certain groups to have a dog in this fight, who have, things that AI impacts, to start getting in the game here and asking your politicians, what are you doing about this? How are we going? Because this is going to be a long, messy process, and it's going to wind up with too much regulations and too little regulations and incorrect legislations and stuff that's just really stupid. However, and this is where I differ most, David, in that in general, I'm like, well, let the market sort it out and let the politicians come in a little bit later. But I'm not so sure that I think that here, which is a bit of a surprise to myself, in that I think the possibilities for problems are so huge that there's a real need for us to perhaps maybe switch that up a little bit. In other words, there's going to be a need for the legislation to move fast if it has a hope of containing things, because some of these things, once they're loose, are going to be really loose. So, if you're listening to this and you've got perspective, I certainly would appreciate your feedback and thoughts. But also maybe this is a bit of a spur to action. Hey, get involved, pay attention, ask some questions. As I'm saying this, I see my state representative typically on the weekends. And so I think I might be asking him, hey, have you thought about this yet? And maybe a little bit like us, politicians love the limelight and they love issues that get them attention. If you're a politician listening to this, everybody's talking about AI. You can get some real press time if you're the one goes out the door and starts writing some stuff about this. Get some things out there for us to think about. I think that's it's going to be a necessary process.
And I would also add to that if you add specifically to your voice in this process, that you don't just add the typical stances of AI is going to turn into the Terminator or AI is going to be the savior of humanity. If you have a different perspective, kind of like the ones that we try to promote here, then at least in our humble opinion, I think that'll probably give you an edge.
Yeah, so if you listen to this, let us know. David's a little more optimistic here about AI's positivity and a little more pessimistic about legislative options being helpful. I find myself, maybe for the first time in my life, not being even further to the inside of that track. And so I'm sitting here finding myself being a little bit more, very uncharacteristically thinking, actually, a little more legislation may not be a bad idea here. And that's a very odd position for me to be in. So, if you are listening to this or want to respond, we'd certainly value your feedback and some different ideas on this. I'm still working my way through the implications of what that would look like. So, like David, I have low confidence in politicians to get this right. However, I do think that there's a role to be played here. The fact that we can, we're sitting in front of bookcases. These books exist because thoughtful legislators crafted a series of laws that allow people to work really hard to write these books and benefit from them and then turn them loose. And there's aspects of that system that probably don't make sense and are not great. And yet you can see the wealth on these bookshelves and say, it must have gotten something right because people write a lot of books that benefit a lot of people. And they wouldn't be able to do that if there wasn't some regulation on how those things were managed. And so, maybe that's a target to aim for. So,
yeah, and I think the final point that I might want to bring up as we bring this to a close here is just that as we're considering how we ought to think about AI and potentially regulate artificial intelligence, is that this is just going to be something that takes a lot of different forms and is on a lot of different scales. When most people hear about artificial intelligence, they're thinking about something like Google Bard or ChatGPT, something that is going to, be a large database of knowledge that was trained on a wide variety of information and is able to answer a bunch of different questions and do a bunch of different cool things with plugins, things like that. But what I think is going to be important to understand is that the concept of artificial intelligence is not just ChatGPT. The same kind of logic and processes behind ChatGPT is what drives, for example, your phone's autocorrect. We talked a little bit in last week's episode about the fact that Apple talked a lot about didn't mention AI at all, but said machine learning, and they said that they improved a lot of their machine learning in their autocorrect. And so definitions, I think, again, is going to be a point that I'll harp on in this week's episode too, is that figuring out exactly what stage you want to really are talking about, what kind of AI you're talking about, is going to become increasingly important because there's going to be so many different kinds. There's going to be the kinds like ChatGPT with their large language models. There's going to be Midjourney, which is image generation. There's going to be eventually there's a bunch of models like ChatGPT that are working towards being multimodal, so being able to do all sorts of different things. And so understanding the fact that it's a technology that has a wide variety of different uses and implications is going to be important for us to understand. And ultimately, for you all listening who are looking to understand, is that it's going to be a technology that takes a lot of different forms and is going to be in a lot of different places that you may be able to point out immediately, or you may not be able to. But how we think about it and how we understand it in all of its different forms, I think, is going to be important as we look towards how we're going to be approaching it in the future.
I think it's good words and worth paying attention to. And again, as we finish this, this is alternative ideas. So this is a little bit more on the cautionary side this week. But there are things to be cautious about. And, we can just find so many examples about this, right? Cars are very good and give us a lot of individual freedom and autonomy and ability and stuff like that. And yet we still have speed limits, stop signs, and things like that. And so, there is a place for those things. And this is the time to be thoughtful about looking at and thinking about those things. And so be thoughtful.
Hey, thank you so much for watching this clip of the Alternative Ideas podcast. If you want to see more clips where we're having discussions just like this one, you can check all of those out, as well as the full episodes of the podcast here on the Alternative Ideas YouTube channel.